The dust had turned her feet into raw, bleeding wounds long before she saw the glimmer of water that wasn't there, and Delilah Sutton knew with absolute certainty that she would die somewhere between this God-forsaken stretch of Nevada desert and the town of Pyramid City that the wagon master had promised lay just beyond the next rise and the next and the next. The September sun of 1878 beat down without mercy, turning the air into something thick and hostile, something that burned her lungs with each desperate breath she dragged into her body. Her shoes had disintegrated mile by mile, first the soles separating from the leather uppers, then the uppers themselves tearing and finally falling away completely, until all that remained were scraps of memory and the knowledge that she had once owned a proper pair of boots that her father had saved 3 months to buy her back in Missouri. The wagon train had left her behind 2 days ago, though it felt like a lifetime compressed into endless burning hours. She had been foolish enough to wander away from camp in the early morning to find privacy, and when she returned, the entire party had vanished. At first she thought it was a cruel joke, but as the sun climbed higher and the wagon tracks stretched endlessly westward, she understood that they had simply forgotten her existence. 23 wagons, 47 people, and not one had noticed that Delilah Sutton was missing. The scout had probably done a head count wrong, or perhaps Mrs. Henderson had claimed Delilah was in another wagon when someone asked. It hardly mattered now. What mattered was that her canteen had run dry yesterday afternoon, and the jerky in her pocket had been consumed this morning, and now there was nothing between her and death except her own stubborn refusal to lie down in the sand and surrender. She had been walking for what she estimated was nearly 40 miles since the wagon train disappeared. Her dress, once a respectable dark blue calico, hung in tatters around her legs, torn by brush and bleached by sun and salt from her own sweat. Her bonnet had blown away hours ago, leaving her dark blonde hair plastered to her skull and her face exposed to the relentless heat. Every step sent shards of agony shooting up from her ruined feet, but she had learned to breathe through the pain, to make it part of the rhythm of her movement. Step, breathe, step, pray, step, breathe. She had been 19 when she left Missouri with her aunt and uncle, seeking a new life in California after her parents died of fever. Her aunt and uncle had died too, somewhere in Wyoming, and she had continued on with the wagon train because there was nowhere else to go. No one waiting for her, nothing behind her but graves and grief. The landscape shimmered and danced, creating towers and lakes that vanished when she drew near. She had stopped believing in the mirages hours ago, but some animal part of her brain still registered them, still felt the cruel stab of hope before reason crushed it down. The desert here was not empty sand like she had imagined deserts to be. Instead, it was decorated with scrub brush and hardy grasses, scattered rocks and distant mountains that seemed to float above the horizon. She could see the Sierra Nevada rising in the far west, snow-capped peaks that promised water and coolness and everything her body craved, but they might as well have been on the moon for all the good they did her now. When her legs finally gave out, she was surprised by how gently she fell. Her body simply folded, knees buckling, and she found herself sitting in the dust with no clear memory of the transition from standing to sitting. This is it, she thought with strange clarity. This is where I die. She had always imagined death would come for her in a bed, in old age, surrounded by children and grandchildren. But life had taught her over these past brutal years that imagination and reality rarely aligned. She tilted her head back and looked at the sky so blue it hurt, and waited for the end to arrive. That was when she heard the horse. At first she thought it was another trick of the desert, another phantom created by her dying brain, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. The rhythmic thud of hooves on packed earth and the creak of leather and the jingle of a bridle. She tried to call out, but her throat was too dry, her tongue swollen and useless. Instead, she raised one arm, a gesture that cost her nearly all her remaining strength, and waved it weakly in the direction of the sound. The rider appeared like something out of a fever dream, wavering in the heat shimmer. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered. his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat the color of desert sand. The horse he rode was a rangy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a steady gait. The man pulled up short when he saw her, and she watched him go very still for a moment, as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. Then he was swinging down from the saddle with practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground with solid authority and crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. "Jesus Christ," he said, and his voice was rough with shock and something deeper, something like anger mixed with horror. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" She tried to answer, but no words came. Her lips cracked and bled when she moved them. He dropped to his knees beside her, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a few days' worth of beard stubble along his jaw. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they widened as he took in her condition. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, worn denim trousers, a faded red shirt, a leather vest, and a gun belt slung low on his hips. Everything about him spoke of competence and hard-earned capability. "Do not try to talk," he said quickly, already reaching for the canteen that hung from his belt. "Your throat is too dry. I am going to give you water, but you have to take it slow, understand? Small sips. If you drink too fast, you will be sick." She managed a tiny nod. He uncapped the canteen with one hand while his other hand came up to support the back of her head with surprising gentleness. The first touch of water against her lips was almost painful in its intensity. She whimpered without meaning to, and his expression darkened with concern. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy now. Just a little bit at a time." He was true to his word, allowing her only the smallest sips, pulling the canteen away when she tried to take more. It was torture and salvation all at once. After several minutes of this careful rationing, she felt her throat loosen enough to speak, though her voice came out as barely more than a rasp. "Wagon train," she managed. "They left me." His jaw tightened. "When?" "2 days, maybe. Hard to know." He cursed under his breath, words she probably should not have heard but was too grateful to care about. He gave her another careful sip of water, then set the canteen aside and began examining her feet. She saw his face go hard when he saw the damage. The raw and bleeding flesh. The burns and cuts and places where the skin had simply worn away entirely. "You have been walking on these for 2 days?" His voice was tight with controlled fury, though she sensed instinctively that the anger was not directed at her. "Had no choice." "Where were you headed?" "Pyramid City." He looked up at that, surprise flickering across his features. "Pyramid City? That is still 10 miles from here, maybe more. You would never have made it." "I know," she whispered. Something shifted in his expression then, some barrier coming down. He studied her face for a long moment, and she wondered what he saw. A fool woman who had gotten herself lost? A burden he had no desire to shoulder? But when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "My name is Kyle Reynolds. I work for the Triple R Ranch about 15 miles south of Pyramid City. I was tracking a mountain lion that has been bothering our cattle when I saw you. Can you tell me your name?" "Delilah Sutton." "Well, Miss Sutton, I'm going to get you to town and to a doctor. But first I need to do something about your feet or the ride is going to be agony." He stood and went to his horse, rummaging in his saddlebags until he produced a surprisingly clean piece of cloth, which he tore into strips. He also pulled out a small tin of what looked like salve. When he returned to her side, he knelt again and began the painstaking work of cleaning and bandaging her feet. His hands were calloused and scarred from years of hard work, but they moved over her injuries with remarkable delicacy. She hissed in pain when the cloth touched the worst of the burns, and he paused immediately. "I am sorry, I know it hurts, but if I do not clean these, infection will set in, and that will be worse." She nodded, biting her lip hard enough to taste blood. He worked as quickly as he could without being careless, cleaning away the dirt and blood, applying the salve, wrapping the strips of cloth around her feet with the practiced ease of someone who had tended many injuries. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and regarded her seriously. "Here is the situation, Miss Sutton. You cannot walk, and my horse cannot carry both of us and all my gear for 10 miles in this heat. So I am going to leave most of my gear here, mark the spot, and come back for it later. I will carry you on the horse with me. It is not going to be comfortable, but it is the best option we have." "You would do that for a stranger?" His gray eyes met hers steadily. "I am not in the habit of leaving people to die in the desert, regardless of whether I know them or not." There was a quality to his voice that suggested he had seen too much death already in his young life, that he carried the weight of losses she could not imagine. She felt a sudden rush of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her dry eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die." "Not today," he said firmly. He stood and offered her his hands. "Can you stand if I help you?" With his support, she managed to get to her feet, though she swayed dangerously and had to lean heavily against him to stay upright. He was solid as an oak tree, his arm around her waist holding her steady. Up close, she could smell the scent of him, horse and leather and sweat, and something underneath that was just him, clean and masculine and oddly comforting. He half carried her to where his horse stood waiting patiently, then very carefully lifted her onto the saddle. The movement pulled a gasp of pain from her, but she gritted her teeth and endured it. He worked quickly, stripping most of the gear from his saddle and piling it in a distinctive spot marked by a large red rock. He kept only his canteen, his rifle, and a small pack that probably contained essentials. Then he swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins, and she found herself cradled against his chest. "Hold on to me," he instructed. "If you start to feel faint, tell me immediately." She nodded and let her head rest against his shoulder, too exhausted to worry about propriety. He clucked to the horse, and they began to move, the gelding settling into a steady walk that ate up the ground without jarring her too badly. True to his word, Kyle stopped every mile or so to give her more water and check that she was still conscious. He spoke to her during these stops, asking her questions about Missouri, about her family, about anything that would keep her engaged and awake. She learned that he had come west from Kentucky 5 years ago, that his father had died in the war, and his mother of heartbreak not long after, that he had a younger sister named Mary who lived in San Francisco with her husband. "Why did you not go to San Francisco with her?" Delilah asked during one of their rest stops, her voice growing stronger as the water worked its magic on her system. "Cities are not for me," Kyle said simply. "I need space, open country. The ranch I work for gave me that. The owner, Robert Drummond, is a good man, tough but fair. He took me on when I was 20 years old and did not know the front end of a cow from the back, taught me everything I know about ranching." "Do you like it? The work, I mean." He considered the question seriously. "I do. It is hard and sometimes dangerous, and the pay is nothing to write home about, but there is something honest about it. You work with your hands, with animals, with the land itself. At the end of the day, you can see what you have accomplished. That matters to me." She understood what he meant. Her own parents had been farmers, and she remembered the satisfaction her father took in a good harvest, the pride her mother felt in her well-tended garden. Simple things, perhaps, but meaningful. As they rode on, and the worst of her thirst and exhaustion began to recede, Delilah became more aware of Kyle's presence behind her, the strength of his arms bracketing her body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of him seeping into her despite the heat of the day. It was an intimacy born of necessity, but she felt something stirring in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the man himself. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that it was just the aftermath of trauma making her feel this connection, but the feeling persisted. Kyle seemed unaware of her thoughts, focused entirely on getting them to Pyramid City as quickly as the horse and heat would allow. But once, when she shifted her weight and nearly slipped, his arm tightened around her waist in a gesture that felt protective rather than merely practical, and she wondered if perhaps she was not the only one feeling something unexpected. The sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains when the buildings of Pyramid City finally appeared on the horizon. It was a small town, raw and new, the kind that sprang up wherever there was mining or ranching or any other enterprise that drew men seeking fortune or escape. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with false-fronted buildings that proclaimed themselves to be a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a livery stable, and various other establishments. At the far end of the street, Delilah could see a white church with a modest steeple, and her heart lifted at the sight. Where there was a church, there was community, and where there was community, there might be a place for her. Kyle guided the horse directly to a building that bore a hand-painted sign reading Dr. Samuel Moore, physician. He dismounted first, then reached up to lift Delilah down with the same careful gentleness he had shown throughout their journey. Her legs wobbled when her bandaged feet touched the ground, and he kept one arm around her waist as he pushed open the door and called out, "Doc Moore, you here? I have someone who needs help." A man emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was perhaps 50, balding, with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a long nose, and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering. But his voice was brisk and professional when he spoke. "Kyle Reynolds, what have you brought me this time? Set her in that chair there, carefully now." Kyle helped Delilah into the indicated chair, and Dr. Moore immediately began his examination, starting with her feet. He made several disapproving noises as he unwrapped Kyle's makeshift bandages, and Delilah tensed, waiting for bad news. "Well, young lady, you have done a considerable amount of damage to yourself," the doctor said finally. "But I have seen worse, much worse. With proper care and rest, you should heal up just fine, though you will be off these feet for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. The burns are superficial, and while the cuts are nasty, none appear to be deep enough to cause permanent damage. You were very lucky." "She was left behind by her wagon train 2 days ago," Kyle interjected. "She walked nearly 40 miles in the desert with no shoes." "Doctor." Moore's eyebrows shot up. 2 days? Then dehydration and sun exposure are also concerns. Young lady, you should be dead." "I nearly was," Delilah admitted. "If Kyle had not found me when he did, I would be." The doctor glanced between them with sharp, assessing eyes, then nodded. "Well then, Mr. Reynolds, it seems you're in the habit of finding people in need of saving. This is the 3rd time this year you have brought someone to my door." Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "I was just doing what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Dr. Moore said dryly, "but we can discuss your modesty later. Right now I need to treat Miss Sutton properly. This will take some time. If you have other business to attend to, you can come back in an hour or so." But Kyle shook his head. "I will stay, if Miss Sutton does not mind. I want to make sure she's all right." Delilah felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I do not mind at all." What followed was an hour of pain as doctor. Moore cleaned and treated her feet more thoroughly than Kyle had been able to do in the desert. He also examined her for sun damage, declared her sunburned but not dangerously so, and made her drink several glasses of water mixed with salt and sugar to help her body recover from the dehydration. Throughout it all, Kyle sat in a chair against the wall, watching with an intensity that made Delilah hyper-aware of his presence. "When Doctor," Moore finally finished, he delivered his instructions in a tone that brooked no argument. "You need rest, proper food, and to stay off those feet completely for at least a week. After that, we will see how the healing is progressing. Do you have somewhere to stay in town? Family? Friends?" Delilah felt her face heat with embarrassment. "No, I have no one. The wagon train I was traveling with was headed to California. I was going with my aunt and uncle, but they died of cholera in Wyoming. I stayed with the train because I had nowhere else to go, and because they said there might be work in California for a woman willing to work hard. I had planned to find work in Pyramid City first to earn enough money for supplies before continuing west." She did not mention that her funds consisted of exactly $3.47, the pitiful remains of everything she owned in the world. Doctor. Moore frowned. "In your condition, you cannot work for weeks. The hotel will want payment up front, and Mrs. Crawford, who runs it, is not known for her charity. I can ask around, see if anyone needs a boarder and would be willing to wait for payment. She can stay at the ranch? Both Delilah and Dr. Moore turned to stare at Kyle, who had stood up and now faced them with an expression of calm determination. The Triple R? Dr. Moore said doubtfully. Kyle, I am not sure that is appropriate. A young unmarried woman staying at a ranch full of cowboys? The boss's wife, Emma, has been saying for months that she needs help with the house and the cooking, especially now that they have the baby. Miss Sutton needs a place to stay and eventually work. It seems like a logical solution. Emma will act as chaperone, so there is no question of impropriety. Doctor. Moore looked skeptical, but hopeful. And you think Robert Drummond would agree to this? I know he would. He is a good man, and so is his wife. They would not turn away someone in need, especially not someone with a genuine willingness to work once she heals. Delilah felt overwhelmed by the offer. I cannot impose like that. You have already done so much for me. Kyle turned those steady gray eyes on her, and she felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze. It is not an imposition. It is a practical arrangement that benefits everyone. You get a safe place to recover and then honest work. Emma gets the help she has been desperate for. Everyone wins. But you barely know me. I could be anyone, a thief, a liar, anything. Are you? He asked simply. No. Then I am not worried. He turned back to Dr. Moore. Can she travel 15 miles to the ranch? Or should she stay in town tonight? The doctor considered. In a wagon, carefully driven, she could probably manage it. On horseback? Absolutely not. Then I will rent a wagon from the livery. We can be back at the ranch before full dark if we leave soon. Everything was happening so fast that Delilah felt dizzy. Less than 6 hours ago, she had been dying alone in the desert. Now she was being offered not just rescue, but a home, work, a future. It seemed too good to be true, and she waited for the trap to reveal itself. But Kyle's expression remained open and honest, and Dr. Moore, despite his concerns about propriety, seemed to trust the young cowboy's judgment. Are you certain about this? She asked Kyle quietly. You do not owe me anything beyond the rescue you have already given me. I am certain, he said firmly. And Miss Sutton, I do not do things out of obligation. I am offering because I want to help and because I think you and the Drummonds will suit each other well. In the end, she agreed, because what other choice did she have? Dr. Moore gave Kyle a bottle of medicine for her feet and strict instructions on care, then accepted payment for his services. Kyle counted out the coins without hesitation, and Delilah added it to the growing ledger of debts she owed this man. The wagon Kyle rented was old but serviceable, with a springy seat and a bed in the back lined with fresh hay. He insisted that Delilah lie down in the back rather than sit on the hard bench, and he made a pillow for her out of his own jacket. As they rolled out of Pyramid City with the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Delilah found herself studying Kyle's back, the set of his shoulders, the confident way he handled the reins. She knew nothing about him beyond what he had told her during their journey, and yet she felt safer with him than she had felt in years. It was a strange and unsettling feeling, this trust that had bloomed so quickly. The ride to the Triple R Ranch took nearly 2 hours, and darkness had fallen by the time they arrived. Delilah had been dozing fitfully, exhausted by the day's events, but she woke when the wagon stopped and voices called out in greeting. Kyle jumped down and went to talk to someone, their voices low and urgent, and then a woman appeared at the back of the wagon holding a lantern high. "My dear girl," the woman said, and her voice was warm and concerned. "Kyle told us what happened to you. I am Emma Drummond. You are very welcome here." Emma Drummond was perhaps 35, with red hair starting to gray at the temples and a face that was kind and careworn in equal measure. She wore a simple dress and an apron, and she radiated maternal competence. Behind her came a tall, broad man with graying brown hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. This, Delilah assumed, was Robert Drummond, owner of the Triple R Ranch. Kyle says you need a place to stay while you heal up, Robert said, his voice a deep rumble. And that after you might be interested in working for us. That about the size of it? Yes, sir, Delilah managed, feeling awkward and vulnerable lying in the hay. I promise I am a hard worker. I was raised on a farm in Missouri. I can cook, clean, sew, tend a garden, care for chickens, milk cows, whatever you need. Can you keep the peace among a dozen hungry cowboys who argue over everything from politics to pie? Emma asked, but there was a twinkle in her eye that took any sting from the words. I can certainly try, madam. Emma laughed. Well, that is more than I expected. Come on, let us get you inside and settled. Robert, you and Kyle carry her. Mind her feet. The doctor said they are badly damaged. Being carried by the two men was mortifying, but Delilah was too tired to protest much. They brought her into the ranch house, a sprawling structure of wood and stone that showed signs of recent expansion. The interior was warm and lived in with comfortable furniture and the lingering smell of that evening's dinner. Emma directed them to a small room off the kitchen, clearly meant for a servant or hired girl, and they laid Delilah carefully on the narrow bed. I will bring you some supper and hot water for washing, Emma said. Tomorrow we will get you properly sorted out with clothes and such. Your dress is barely holding together. I do not have money to pay you for clothing, Delilah said miserably. I have $3 to my name, and I already owe Dr. Moore and Kyle more than I can easily repay. You owe me nothing, Kyle said from the doorway, and the Drummonds are not going to charge you for basic necessities. Once you are well enough to work, you can earn your keep. Until then, consider yourself a guest who has had a run of bad luck. Robert nodded agreement. Kyle has the right of it. We have all needed help at one time or another. Right now, you need help. When you are able, you will help us. That is how communities work, Miss Sutton. Tears stung Delilah's eyes at the simple kindness of these strangers. Thank you, she whispered. All of you. I will not let you down. After the Drummonds left to fetch her supper, Kyle lingered for a moment in the doorway. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, making him look older, more serious. Get some rest, he said quietly. You have been through hell today. Tomorrow will be better. Will I see you tomorrow? The question escaped before she could stop it, and she felt her face heat with embarrassment at how eager she sounded, but Kyle smiled, a slow, warm expression that transformed his normally serious face. I will be around. The bunkhouse is just across the yard, and I take my meals in the main house with the other senior hands. You will probably see more of me than you want to. I doubt that, she said softly. Something flickered in his eyes, some emotion she could not quite name. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he just nodded once and withdrew, leaving her alone in the small, safe room. Emma returned with a tray laden with beef stew, fresh bread, butter, and a cup of milk still warm from the cow. She helped Delilah sit up carefully and settled the tray on her lap, then bustled around preparing a basin of warm water and clean cloths. You eat while I wash your face and arms, Emma instructed. You are covered in dust and dried sweat. You will feel better once you are clean. As Emma worked with the brisk efficiency of a woman used to caring for others, she chatted about the ranch, about her husband Robert, about their year-old son Samuel, who was already sleeping in his cradle upstairs. She talked about the challenges of running a household in the middle of nowhere, about the difficulties of finding good help, about how Kyle had been a godsend these past 5 years. He is the most reliable man I have ever known besides my Robert, Emma said as she wrung out a cloth. Never complains, always does more than his share, looks out for the younger hands. Some of the other ranchers have tried to lure him away with promises of better pay, but he stays loyal. That means something in this country, where men drift from place to place like tumbleweeds. He seems very kind, Delilah ventured. Emma gave her a sharp look that held a hint of speculation. He is kind, yes, but do not mistake kindness for softness. Kyle is tough when he needs to be, and he does not suffer fools. He has seen hard times, that one. Lost his whole family, came west alone, built a life for himself through sheer determination and honest work. A woman could do worse than set her sights on a man like that. Delilah nearly choked on her stew. I was not setting my sights on anyone. I just met him today. Emma laughed, a rich, warm sound. Oh, I know, dear. I am just planting seeds, as they say. You are a pretty girl, or you will be once you heal up and get some meat back on your bones. Kyle is a handsome young man. You are both unmarried and of an age. It would be strange if there was not at least some spark of interest. Mrs. Drummond, I have nothing to offer a man like Kyle. I am an orphan with no money, no prospects, nothing but the clothes on my back, which are not even whole anymore. I'm hardly a catch. Emma set down the cloth and fixed Delilah with a serious look. Let me tell you something, girl. Out here, what matters is not what you came from, but what you are made of. Can you work hard? Can you face difficulties without falling apart? Can you build something from nothing? If the answer is yes, then you have more to offer than many folks I could name. Kyle sees that in you, I think. Otherwise, he would not have brought you here. Delilah wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a lead weight. Emma seemed to recognize this because she took away the empty dishes and helped Delilah lie back down, covering her with a light quilt. Sleep now, Emma said gently. Tomorrow is soon enough to worry about the future. But as Delilah drifted off to sleep, it was not the future in general that occupied her thoughts. It was a pair of steady gray eyes and a voice promising that everything would be all right. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange liminal space between illness and health, dependence and recovery. Dr. Moore came out to the ranch every few days to check on Delilah's progress, and each time he pronounced himself satisfied with how her feet were healing. The worst of the burns faded to pink, tender skin, and the cuts closed and began to scar over. Emma kept her strictly off her feet for the first week, bringing her meals and helping her with personal necessities in a matter-of-fact way that somehow preserved Delilah's dignity, despite the humiliation of being so helpless. Kyle visited every day, usually in the evening after his work was done. He would knock softly on her door and ask if she needed anything, if she was comfortable, if there was anything he could bring her. Often he would sit in the chair by her bed and talk to her about his day, about the ranch, about the countryside. He told her stories about ornery cattle and clever horses, about encounters with coyotes and rattlesnakes, about the beauty of dawn breaking over the mountains. His voice was soothing, and Delilah found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that went beyond mere boredom. She learned things about him in these conversations, small details that built into a larger picture. He had been 13 when the war ended, and his father had not come home. His mother had tried to keep their small Kentucky farm going, but without a man's labor, it had been impossible, and she had worked herself into an early grave. Kyle and his sister Mary had been taken in by an uncle who resented the burden and made sure they knew it every day. As soon as Mary was 16 and could legally marry, Kyle had arranged her match with a merchant in San Francisco who would treat her well, and then he had struck out on his own, determined never to be dependent on anyone's charity again. That is why I understand what you are feeling, he said one evening as they sat in the gathering dusk, her room lit only by a single lamp. The anger at needing help, the shame of being unable to care for yourself. I felt that way for years after my mother died. But I learned eventually that accepting help when you need it is not weakness. It is just being human. How did you learn that? Delilah asked softly. Robert Drummond taught me. I came to the R convinced I had to prove myself every single minute, that if I showed any vulnerability, I would be thrown out. But Robert saw through all that bluster and fear. He told me that strength was not about never falling down. It was about getting back up and asking for a hand when you needed one. Changed my whole way of thinking. Delilah studied his face in the lamplight, the strong lines of his jaw, the way his eyes reflected the flame. You admire him very much. I do. He is the kind of man I hope to be someday. Fair, honest, strong, but not cruel. He has built something real here, something that will last. That is what I want for myself eventually. Not just to work for someone else's dream, but to have my own. What is your dream? The question was bold, perhaps too personal, but she wanted to know. Kyle was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "A ranch of my own. Not huge like the Triple R, but enough land to run cattle and horses to build a life. A house that is more than 4 walls and a roof. A family." He paused, then added quietly, "That is years away, though. Maybe decades. I am saving every penny I can spare, but land is expensive, and starting a ranch from nothing takes capital I do not have yet." "You will do it," Delilah said with certainty. "I can tell. You are the kind of man who sets his mind to something and does not quit until it is done." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in the air between them shifted, became charged with a tension that made her breath catch. For a moment she thought he might lean forward, might close the distance between them, and her heart began to hammer against her ribs. But then footsteps sounded in the hall, and the moment broke. Kyle stood quickly, clearing his throat. "I should let you rest. Emma will have my hide if I tire you out." After he left, Delilah lay in the darkness and tried to sort through the tangle of feelings in her chest. She barely knew this man. It had only been 2 weeks since he pulled her out of the desert. This attraction she felt, this growing fascination with his every word and gesture, was surely just gratitude magnified by proximity and circumstance. It could not be anything real, anything lasting. But her heart-stubborn organ that it was did not seem to care about logic. By the end of the 2nd week, Dr. Moore declared Delilah fit enough to begin walking short distances, provided she wore the soft moccasins Emma had made for her and did not overdo it. Delilah had never been so happy to hear anything in her life. Being bedridden had chafed at her spirit, making her feel useless and burdensome despite Emma's constant reassurances. Her first real task was helping Emma with the cooking for the ranch hands. The Triple R employed 12 full-time cowboys plus Robert himself, and feeding that many hungry men 3 times a day was an enormous undertaking. Emma had been managing it alone except for busy seasons when they hired a temporary cook, but the work was wearing her down, especially with baby Samuel requiring constant attention. Delilah threw herself into the work with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. She needed to prove her worth, to earn her place here, to repay the debt of kindness she had been given. She woke before dawn to help Emma prepare breakfast, worked through the day on cleaning and food preparation and laundry and 100 other tasks, and fell into bed each night exhausted but satisfied. The cowboys were a mixed bunch, ranging from boys barely old enough to shave to grizzled veterans of the range. They were initially wary of Delilah, uncertain how to behave around a respectable woman in their midst, but she quickly won them over with good food, fair treatment, and a sense of humor that could hold its own against their rough teasing. Within a few weeks, they were joking with her as they might with a sister, and she found herself feeling part of something for the first time since her parents died. Kyle remained somewhat apart from the easy camaraderie that developed. He was friendly but reserved, treating her with unfailing courtesy, but none of the casual familiarity the other hands showed. At first, Delilah thought she had imagined the connection between them, that those charged moments in her room had been products of her own wishful thinking. But sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, and her pulse would quicken despite her best efforts at control. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the threat of early snow in the higher elevations. The ranch entered its busiest season as they worked to move cattle down from the summer pastures and prepare for winter. The men left before dawn and often did not return until after dark, and when they did, they were bone-tired and ravenous. Delilah and Emma worked like demons to keep them fed and the house running smoothly. One evening in mid-October, a commotion in the yard brought Delilah running from the kitchen. She arrived in time to see several of the hands helping a blood-soaked Kyle down from his horse. Her heart stopped dead in her chest. "What happened?" she demanded, rushing forward. "Mountain lion," one of the hands said grimly. "Same one Kyle was tracking when he found you. It came at him while he was riding fence line up in the canyon. He managed to shoot it, but not before it got its claws into him." Kyle's shirt was torn and bloody across the left shoulder and upper chest. His face was pale beneath its tan, and he moved stiffly, clearly in pain. But when his eyes met Delilah's, he managed a ghost of his usual calm expression. "It looks worse than it is," he said. "The hell it does," Robert Drummond said, appearing from the barn. "Emma, get the medical supplies. Delilah, help me get him into the house. Someone ride for Dr. Moore." They half-carried Kyle into the house and laid him on the kitchen table, the only surface large and sturdy enough. Emma appeared with her kit of bandages, salves, and the precious bottle of whiskey kept for medical emergencies. Robert carefully cut away Kyle's ruined shirt, revealing 4 deep gashes that ran from his collarbone down across his pectoral muscle. Blood welled sluggishly from the wounds. "Missed anything vital," Robert assessed, "but he is going to need stitches, and we cannot wait for Doc Moore. That is 2 hours away at best." "I can do it," Delilah heard herself say. Everyone turned to stare at her. She swallowed hard but did not back down. "My mother taught me to stitch wounds. Our farm was miles from the nearest doctor. I've closed up cuts from knives, axes, farm implements. These are deeper, but the principle is the same." "Have you ever done it on a person?" Emma asked. "Twice. Once on my father when he was badly cut by a scythe, once on a hired man who fell through a barn roof. Both healed clean." Robert looked at Kyle. "It is your hide. What do you say?" Kyle's gray eyes fixed on Delilah. Despite the pain he must be in, his voice was steady. "I trust her." Those 3 words hit Delilah with unexpected force. He trusted her. After everything, despite barely knowing her, he trusted her to do this. She squared her shoulders and moved to the table, pushing aside fear and uncertainty. "Someone hold him down," she instructed. "This is going to hurt like hell." What followed was the longest hour of Delilah's life. Kyle did not make a sound as she cleaned the wounds with whiskey, did not flinch as she threaded the needle Emma had boiled for sterilization, did not cry out as she began the painstaking work of drawing his torn flesh back together. But she could feel the tension in his body, could see the white-knuckled grip he maintained on the edge of the table, could watch the sweat bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air. She worked as quickly as she dared without sacrificing precision, her stitches small and even, her hands steady despite the churning in her stomach. This was Kyle beneath her hands, Kyle's blood on her fingers, Kyle's pain she was causing even as she tried to heal. The intimacy of it, the responsibility, threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed those feelings aside and focused entirely on the task. When she finally tied off the last stitch and sat back, her hands were shaking. Emma immediately took over, bandaging the wounds with practiced efficiency while Robert helped Kyle sit up carefully. The cowboy's face was gray with pain and shock, but he managed a weak smile. "Told you it looked worse than it was," he said, and promptly fainted. They carried him to a room upstairs, one of the spare bedrooms kept for emergencies. Emma shooed everyone out except Delilah, whom she pressed into service, helping her get Kyle out of his blood-soaked trousers and into clean night clothes. It was deeply improper, but practicality trumped propriety on a ranch. And besides, Kyle was unconscious and therefore unaware of the indignity. Once he was settled and comfortable, Emma turned to Delilah with a serious expression. "You did good work there, girl. Probably saved us hours of bleeding and risk of infection. He owes you his life now, same as you owe him yours." "I just did what needed doing," Delilah said quietly. "Maybe so, but I saw your face while you worked. That was not just duty I was seeing." Delilah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I do not know what you mean." "I think you do." Emma's voice was gentle now. "It is all right to care for him, Delilah. In fact, I think it might be good for both of you." Before Delilah could formulate a response to that, Dr. Moore arrived, summoned by the writer Robert had sent. He examined Kyle thoroughly, checked Delilah's stitching with a critical eye, and pronounced himself satisfied. "Well done, Miss Sutton," he said approvingly. "These are as neat as any I have seen, and I have seen plenty. The wounds are clean, no signs of infection yet, though we will need to watch carefully over the next few days. Mountain lion claws carry all sorts of bacteria. If he starts running a fever or the wounds show signs of going septic, send for me immediately. Over the next 3 days, Delilah barely left Kyle's side. She took shifts with Emma, sitting by his bed, changing his bandages, coaxing water and broth into him when he was awake enough to swallow. He developed a fever on the second day, as Dr. Moore had feared, and for one terrifying night they fought to bring his temperature down, bathing him in cool water and forcing willow bark tea down his throat every hour. Delilah sat beside him through the worst of it, listening to him mumble deliriously about things she could not follow, about his mother and his sister and cattle and mountains on fire. Once he called out a name she did not recognize, his voice cracking with anguish. Once he grabbed her hand with surprising strength and stared at her with fever-bright eyes. "Have to tell you," he muttered. "Have to say. Cannot leave without saying." "Saying what?" she asked gently. "Kyle, what do you need to say?" But he had already slipped back into unconsciousness, and she was left wondering what confession or revelation had seemed so urgent in his fevered state. The fever broke just before dawn on the third day. Delilah had dozed off in the chair beside his bed, exhausted from the long night of vigil. She woke to find Kyle watching her, his eyes clear and lucid for the first time in days. "You are awake," she said, relief flooding through her so intensely it made her dizzy. "Thank God. You scared us." "How long?" His voice was a rasp, throat raw from fever. 3 days. You had an infection from the mountain lion claws. Dr. Moore said it was touch and go for a while." She reached for the water pitcher and poured him a glass, helping him sit up enough to drink. He winced at the movement, but managed several swallows before falling back against the pillows. "You stayed with me," he said. It was not a question. Someone had to. Emma and I took turns. "But you are here now. Emma is not." She hesitated, then decided honesty was the only option. "I was worried about you. I wanted to be here when you woke up." Something shifted in his expression, softened. "Delilah." The way he said her name with such tenderness made her breath catch. "There is something I need to tell you. I tried during the fever, but I do not think I managed it clearly." "You do not have to tell me anything? You should rest?" "No, I need to say this while I have the clarity and courage." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and rough against hers. "I know it has only been a month since I found you in the desert. I know it is too soon, that I should be patient and give you time to settle, to figure out what you want. But I have never been good at hiding what I feel, and life is too short to waste opportunities." Her heart was hammering so hard she thought he must surely hear it. "Kyle, what are you saying?" "I am saying that I care about you, Delilah Sutton, more than I have cared about anyone in a very long time. I am saying that I think about you constantly, that I look for excuses to see you, that when I was in that fever and thought I might die, the thing that made me fight to live was the knowledge that I had not told you how I feel. I am not asking for anything from you. I am not pressuring you. I just needed you to know." Delilah felt tears spring to her eyes. "You foolish man," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "Do you think I have been any different? Do you think I have not been watching for you, listening for your voice, finding reasons to be wherever you are? I have been fighting this feeling because I thought it was impossible, that you could not possibly see me as anything more than a burden you rescued." "A burden?" He almost laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his injuries. "Delilah, you are the strongest, most capable woman I have ever met. You walked 40 miles through the desert rather than give up. You learned an entire household's worth of work in 2 weeks. You stitched me up without hesitation when I needed help. How could you possibly think I see you as a burden? Because I have nothing to offer you, no money, no family, no prospects. You have yourself. That is everything." She could not stop the tears now, and she did not try. She leaned forward and very carefully, mindful of his injuries, pressed her forehead against his shoulder. His uninjured arm came around her, holding her close, and for a long moment they simply existed together, breathing in synchrony, hearts beating in time. "This is insane," she whispered. "We barely know each other." Then we will take the time to learn. I am not going anywhere, and neither are you. We have all the time in the world. And somehow, despite the impossibility of it all, despite every logical objection her mind could raise, Delilah believed him. Kyle recovered quickly after the fever broke, his natural constitution and Delilah's careful nursing helping him heal faster than Dr. Moore had predicted. Within a week, he was up and moving around, though Emma and Robert strictly forbade him from doing any actual ranch work for at least another week. He chafed at the enforced idleness, but obeyed, spending his time helping Delilah and Emma with lighter household tasks and entertaining baby Samuel, who had developed a serious case of hero worship for the tall cowboy. The relationship between Kyle and Delilah shifted after his confession, becoming both easier and more intense. They no longer tried to hide their feelings or maintain careful distance. He would catch her hand as she passed him in the kitchen, stealing a moment of connection. She would lean against him as they sat on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the mountains. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and hopes and fears. The other ranch hands noticed, of course. It would have been impossible for them not to. But their teasing was gentle and good-natured, and even the most rough-hewn among them seemed pleased to see Kyle happy. Robert and Emma were openly delighted, treating the budding romance as a foregone conclusion of eventual marriage. As November arrived and the weather turned truly cold, the ranch settled into its winter routine. The cattle were down from the high country, the hay was stored, the equipment was repaired and ready for spring. The pace of work slowed somewhat, though there were still endless daily tasks of feeding animals, mending fences, cutting firewood, and maintaining the buildings. One Saturday evening in late November, Robert called Kyle into his office. Delilah was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when Kyle emerged an hour later, his face showing a mixture of excitement and something that looked like nervousness. He found her alone, Emma having taken Samuel upstairs for bed. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Maybe outside? It is cold, but clear." Curious and a bit concerned by his serious tone, Delilah wrapped herself in a shawl and followed him out to the porch. The stars were brilliant overhead, the Milky Way a river of light across the black sky. Kyle led her to the bench at the far end of the porch, the spot that had become their usual meeting place, and they sat down close together, his arm around her shoulders and her head against his chest. "Robert made me an offer tonight," Kyle said after a moment. "A very generous offer." "What kind of offer?" "There's a piece of land adjacent to the Triple R, about 300 acres, that has been sitting empty for years. The previous owner died, and his children back east have no interest in it, want to sell it cheap just to be rid of the property taxes. Robert has been thinking about buying it himself to expand his grazing land, but tonight he suggested something different. He offered to loan me the money to buy it, to be paid back out of my wages over the next several years. He said he would also loan me enough to buy starter cattle and basic equipment. He said it was time I had my own place, that I had earned it through 5 years of loyal service." Delilah pulled back to look at him, her heart swelling with joy for him. "Kyle, that is wonderful. That is your dream. What you have been working toward, you should absolutely accept." "I want to, God, I want to, but there is a complication." "What complication?" He took both her hands in his gray eyes serious in the starlight. "Delilah, we have known each other for just over 2 months. By all logic and convention, that is nowhere near long enough to make the kind of decision I want to make, but I know my own mind, and I know my own heart. I am not the kind of man who loves lightly or changes his affections with the wind. When I commit to something, I commit completely and forever." Her breath caught as she realized where this was going. "Kyle, let me finish, please." He swallowed hard, and she could see that he was genuinely nervous now, this man who faced down mountain lions and dangerous cattle without flinching. "If I am going to start a ranch, I do not want to do it alone. I want to build something with someone, for someone. I want a partner in every sense of the word. Delilah, I am asking if you would consider being my wife. I know it is fast. I know you have every reason to want more time, to be cautious, But I also know that life is uncertain and tomorrow is promised to no one. I love you. I want to spend my life with you. If you need time to think about it, I understand. If you want to wait longer before giving me an answer, I can be patient. But I needed to put it out there, because the alternative is to start this ranch alone, and I find I cannot stand the thought of that. Delilah felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were tears of joy so pure it was almost painful. Yes, she said, and then louder, yes, yes, I will marry you. The relief and happiness that flooded Kyle's face was beautiful to see. He pulled her into his arms, careful of his still healing shoulder, and kissed her with a passion that had been held carefully in check for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I will make you happy, he promised. I swear it. I will work every day of my life to make sure you never regret this choice. I could never regret choosing you, she said simply. You saved my life in that desert, Kyle Reynolds, but more than that, you gave me a reason to want to live it. I love you. They sat together under the stars for a long time, making plans and sharing dreams, talking about the ranch they would build and the life they would make. It was the kind of conversation that newly engaged couples have had since the beginning of time, full of hope and optimism and the unshakable belief that love can overcome any obstacle. When they finally went inside, they found Emma and Robert still up, drinking coffee in the kitchen. One look at their faces, and Emma squealed with delight. I knew it. Robert, I told you he was going to propose tonight, did I not? Robert smiled, his weathered face crinkling with genuine pleasure. You did indeed. Congratulations to both of you. Kyle, you are getting a fine woman. Delilah, you're getting a fine man. I expect you will be very happy together. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in mid-December. In the small white church in Pyramid City, it was a simple affair attended by everyone from the Triple R Ranch plus half the town, who had heard the romantic story of the woman rescued from the desert and the cowboy who found her. The preacher, a young man named Timothy Walsh, who was new to Pyramid City himself, performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity and a few welcome touches of humor. Delilah wore a dress that Emma had altered from her own wedding gown, cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Kyle wore new clothes purchased for the occasion, black trousers, a white shirt, a dark vest, and a string tie. He had even shaved and gotten his hair cut, though the latter made Delilah laugh because he looked so uncomfortable with it shorter. When Preacher Walsh pronounced them man and wife, and Kyle kissed her there in front of everyone, Delilah felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm cloak. This was where she was meant to be. This was who she was meant to be with. All the hardship and loss that had brought her to Nevada, all the suffering in the desert that had nearly killed her, had led her to this moment, to this man, to this new beginning. The reception was held in the church's meeting hall with food and music and dancing that went on until well after dark. The cowboys from the Triple R taught Delilah to dance Western style, swinging her around until she was dizzy and laughing. Kyle danced with her too, though he claimed he was terrible at it, and she found she did not care if he stepped on her feet because he held her like she was precious and looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. As the evening wound down and people began to depart for their homes, Robert pulled Kyle aside. Delilah, watching from across the room, saw him press something into Kyle's hand and say something that made Kyle's eyes go bright with emotion. Later, when they were alone in the wagon heading back to the ranch, Kyle told her what Robert had said. He told me he was proud of me, that he thought of me like a son, and that he could not be happier to have me as a neighbor and friend. And then he gave me this. Kyle opened his hand to reveal a key. It is to the old cabin on the property I bought. He had some of the hands spend the last week fixing it up, making it livable. He said it is not much, but it is a roof over our heads while we build something better. Delilah took the key and closed his fingers over it again. It sounds perfect. They spent their wedding night in that cabin, a simple 2-room structure that had indeed been cleaned and repaired by the generous hands of the Triple R crew. Someone, probably Emma, had stocked it with basic supplies and left a note wishing them happiness. There was a bed with fresh linens, a stove with wood already laid, a table and 2 chairs, and little else. But to Delilah it felt like a palace because it was theirs, the first home she had truly owned since her parents died. Kyle lit a fire in the stove to ward off the December chill, then turned to his new wife with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said softly, testing out the name. "Mr. Reynolds," she replied, smiling. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. "I love you, Delilah Reynolds. I am going to love you for the rest of my life." "Good," she said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands, "because I plan to hold you to that promise every single day." Their first kiss as man and wife was different from all the ones that had come before. There was no need for restraint now, no propriety to maintain, no barriers between them. When he lifted her and carried her to the bed, she went willingly, joyfully, ready to begin this new chapter of their lives together. Winter passed in a blur of hard work and harder-won progress. Kyle and Delilah worked side by side from dawn to dusk, building their ranch from nothing. They expanded the cabin, adding a proper kitchen and a second bedroom for the children they hoped to have. They built a barn and corrals. They branded their first cattle, 20 head purchased from Robert at a fair price. They endured freezing temperatures and snowstorms, days when the work seemed impossible and the dream too distant. But they also had moments of perfect happiness, evenings spent by the fire, reading to each other from the handful of books they owned, Sunday dinners at the Triple R with the Drummonds, who had become like family, stolen kisses in the barn while doing chores, nights wrapped in each other's arms, talking about the future they were building. In March, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. She told Kyle one evening after supper, shy and excited and a little scared. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then set her down gently and dropped to his knees in front of her, pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "Hello in there," he murmured. "This is your father. I promise to love you and protect you and teach you everything I know. Your mother and I cannot wait to meet you." Their son was born in November of 1879, exactly 1 year after the night Kyle proposed. They named him Thomas, after Kyle's father, and he had his mother's blonde hair and his father's gray eyes. Kyle was besotted from the first moment, handling the tiny infant with the same gentle competence he brought to everything he did. Delilah, watching him rock their son to sleep while humming an old Kentucky lullaby, felt her heart might burst from the sheer fullness of her happiness. The ranch continued to grow. By 1882, they had 200 head of cattle and had built a proper house to replace the old cabin. By 1885, they had expanded to 500 head and hired their first full-time hand, a young man named James who reminded Kyle of himself at that age. Their family grew too. A daughter named Grace arrived in 1881, followed by another son, Henry, in 1884. Through it all, the love between Kyle and Delilah only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, their moments of frustration and misunderstanding. Ranching was brutal work that tested both body and spirit. There were years of drought and years of hard winters. There were cattle lost to disease, horses gone lame, equipment broken at the worst possible times. There were days when Delilah was so tired she wanted to cry, and nights when Kyle lay awake worrying about money and feed costs and whether they could make it another year. But they faced it all together, and that made all the difference. When one faltered, the other stepped up. When one despaired, the other provided hope. They had built their life on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose, and that foundation proved unshakable. On a September evening in 1888, 10 years after Kyle had found Delilah dying in the desert, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become so familiar. Their children were in bed. The ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, and for a moment they had peace and quiet in each other. "Do you ever think about that day?" Kyle asked softly. "The day I found you?" Every day, Delilah said honestly. Every single day I think about how close I came to dying out there. And every day I thank God that you were the one who found me. I think about it too, about how easily I could have ridden a different direction, tracked that mountain lion a different way, about how many things had to go exactly right for me to be in that exact spot at that exact time. It feels like fate. Maybe it was, Delilah said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Maybe we were always meant to find each other one way or another. Kyle wrapped his arm around her and pressed a kiss to her hair. I walked into the desert that day looking for a mountain lion. I found a wife, a partner, a love I did not even know I was missing. Best trade I ever made. She laughed and tilted her face up to his. I walked into the desert expecting to die. Instead, I found a life beyond anything I had imagined. I found you. And I carried you the last 10 miles, he said, echoing the story that had become something of a legend in Pyramid City. A romantic tale that people told to illustrate the kindness of strangers and the power of love. You carried me, she agreed, and you have been carrying me ever since in one way or another. No, he said seriously, we carry each other. That is what partners do. She could not argue with that, and she did not try. Instead, she kissed him, there in the golden light of the setting sun, and felt the same rush of love and gratitude that had filled her heart on their wedding day 10 years before. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joys and sorrows, as years always do. They buried Emma Drummond in 1890 after a sudden illness, mourning the loss of the woman who had been like a mother to them both. Robert followed her 4 years later, his heart simply giving out one night in his sleep. They attended the weddings of friends and the christenings of neighbors' children. They weathered economic depressions and droughts and all the challenges that come with running a ranch in unforgiving country. Their children grew up strong and capable, learning the ranch business from the ground up. Thomas proved to have his father's way with horses and his mother's head for numbers. Grace was fearless and independent, able to outride most of the ranch hands by the time she was 14. Henry had inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's compassion, and showed signs of becoming a natural leader. In 1895, when Kyle was 42 and Delilah was 36, they sat down with their children and told them the full story of how they met, holding nothing back. Thomas was 15, Grace was 13, and Henry was 10, old enough to understand and appreciate the tale. So Mama almost died in the desert? Henry asked, his eyes wide. I would have died, Delilah confirmed. If your father had not found me exactly when he did, I would not have survived another hour. And you walked 40 miles with no shoes? Grace asked, clearly awed by the idea. I did, and let me tell you, it was the hardest thing I ever did, but I kept going because I refused to give up. Sometimes survival is just about being too stubborn to quit. Thomas, the eldest and most thoughtful, looked between his parents with a new understanding in his eyes. You saved each other, he said quietly. Papa saved Mama's life, and then Mama saved Papa's life when the mountain lion attacked him, and then you built all this together. That is exactly right, Kyle said. We saved each other, and then we built a life together. That is what marriage is, what partnership is, finding someone who will stand with you through the hard times and celebrate with you through the good times, someone who makes you stronger and better than you could be alone. Is that why you are always holding hands? Henry asked with the bluntness of a 10-year-old. Delilah laughed. Partly, but mostly it is because I love holding your father's hand. Even after 17 years, it still makes me happy. Kyle squeezed her hand as if to prove the point, and she saw their children exchange glances that said their parents were hopelessly romantic and possibly embarrassing, but in a way that was secretly pleasing. As the children grew older and began making their own paths in the world, Kyle and Delilah found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. They took long rides through the countryside they had made their own, exploring hidden valleys and mountain meadows. They spent evenings reading together, discussing everything from politics to philosophy. They made love with the comfort and familiarity of long partnership, but also with the passion that had never quite faded, that spark that had ignited in a desert 10 years ago still burning bright. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Thomas married a young woman named Elizabeth from Pyramid City. The wedding was held at the Reynolds Ranch, now one of the most prosperous in the county, and the celebration lasted 2 days. Watching her son pledge his love to his bride, Delilah felt the circle complete in some way. Her own wedding had been the beginning of everything good in her life. Now she got to watch her son begin his own journey. "What are you thinking?" Kyle murmured, appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "That I am old," she said with a smile. "You are 37. That is hardly ancient. Old enough to have a married son. Old enough to be thinking about grandchildren." "Thinking about them or hoping for them?" she laughed. "Both. Is that terrible?" "Not at all. I think you will make an excellent grandmother, and you will make an excellent grandfather. You always were wonderful with children." He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "I had good practice with our 3. Speaking of which, have you noticed Grace making eyes at that new hand we hired last month, the one from Colorado?" "David?" Delilah sighed. "Yes, I have noticed. She thinks she is being subtle. Should we be concerned?" "Only if he is not respectful of her, if he treats her well, and she is happy. Then we should probably accept that our daughter is growing up." Kyle groaned. "I am not ready for that." "Too bad. Ready or not, our children are becoming adults. That is the natural order of things." He was quiet for a moment, watching the party swirl around them, then said softly, "We did well, didn't we? With them, with the ranch, with us?" "We did better than well," Delilah said, turning to face him fully. "Kyle, we built something extraordinary, not just the ranch, though that is impressive enough. But we built a life, a family, a love that has lasted through everything. We took 2 broken, lost people and made something whole and strong. I would say that counts as better than well." He kissed her then, not caring that they were in the middle of a party, not caring who might see. When he pulled back, his gray eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you, Delilah Reynolds. I have loved you since the moment I saw you sitting in that desert, refusing to give up even though any sensible person would have. I will love you until my last breath." "I love you too," she said. "Thank you for carrying me those last 10 miles. Thank you for carrying me ever since." "Thank you for letting me," he replied. Grace did eventually marry David, the cowboy from Colorado, in 1903. Henry went off to agricultural college in California, determined to learn new ranching techniques to bring back to the family operation. The ranch continued to prosper under Kyle and Delilah's management, becoming known throughout Nevada for the quality of its cattle and the fairness of its owners. Grandchildren arrived in due course. Thomas and Elizabeth had 3 children, Grace and David had 4, and even Henry, who everyone thought would remain a bachelor forever, surprised them all by marrying a school teacher from Reno and promptly starting a family. Through it all, through the decades that rolled by like waves on a shore, Kyle and Delilah remained at the center of it all, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They grew older together, their hair graying and their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work. But they also grew deeper together, their connection becoming something so fundamental that neither could imagine existence without the other. On their 30th wedding anniversary in December of 1908, their children and grandchildren threw them a massive party at the ranch. Nearly 200 people attended, testament to the respect and affection the Reynolds had earned over 3 decades in Nevada. There were speeches and toasts, embarrassing stories, and heartfelt tributes. But the moment that Delilah treasured most came at the end of the evening, when everyone had gone home or to bed, and she and Kyle stood alone in their bedroom helping each other out of their fancy party clothes. 30 years, Kyle marveled, carefully unhooking the back of her dress. 30 years since I asked you to marry me under the stars. 31 since I found you in the desert. Do you regret any of it? She asked, though she knew the answer. Not a single moment, even the hard times, the losses, the struggles. I would do it all again exactly the same way if it meant ending up here with you." She turned to face him, taking his weathered, work-worn hands in hers. "I am a very lucky woman, Kyle Reynolds." "I am a very lucky man, Delilah Reynolds. You walked until your shoes were just memories, and I carried you the last 10 miles. But the truth is, we have been carrying each other ever since. We have been each other's strength and support and salvation. That is the real story, the one that matters." "Then let us make sure that story continues for many more years to come," she said, pulling him close. "I am counting on it," he murmured against her hair. And so they did. They lived into their 60s together, watching their children build their own ranches and businesses, watching their grandchildren grow and thrive, watching the 20th century transform the West from the wild frontier they had known into something more settled and civilized. They saw automobiles replace horses in town, saw telegraph lines and then telephone lines connect once isolated communities, saw the old rough and tumble ways give way to law and order and respectability. But some things never changed. Kyle still rose before dawn to check on the cattle. Delilah still made the best biscuits in the county. They still held hands while sitting on the porch in the evening. They still kissed each other goodbye every morning and hello every evening. They still spoke of their love freely and often, not caring if others thought them sentimental. When Kyle died peacefully in his sleep in 1925 at the age of 72, Delilah felt like half of her soul had been torn away. But she did not collapse or fall apart. She mourned deeply and honestly, but she also continued. She ran the ranch with help from Thomas and Henry. She spent time with her grandchildren and the great-grandchildren who had started arriving. She told anyone who would listen about the man she had loved for 47 years. The cowboy who had saved her life and then given her a reason to live it. She survived him by 12 years, remaining sharp and active almost to the end. When she finally passed away in 1937 at the age of 78, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and Kyle had created, her last words were about him. "I see him," she whispered to Grace, who sat holding her hand. "He is waiting for me. Same as that day in the desert, he is waiting to carry me home." They buried her beside Kyle in the small family cemetery on the ranch, under a tree they had planted together on their first anniversary. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and dates and a single line beneath. "She walked until her shoes were just memories. He carried her the last 10 miles. Together they built a life and a love that lasted forever." And in Pyramid City, Nevada, and throughout the surrounding country, the story of Kyle and Delilah Reynolds became the kind of legend that people told around fires and at gatherings, a testament to the power of love, the importance of kindness, and the way 2 broken people can heal each other and build something beautiful from nothing. It became a story about survival and courage, about taking chances and following your heart, about the truth that sometimes the hardest journey leads to the greatest joy. And decades later, when their great-great-grandchildren walked the land that Kyle and Delilah had carved from the wilderness, they did so knowing they walked in the footsteps of something rare and precious, a love story for the ages, born in the harsh Nevada desert and tempered by years of hard work and harder-won happiness, a story that proved that sometimes the best things in life come to those who refuse to give up, who keep walking even when their shoes are just memories, who accept help when it is offered, and who recognize love when it appears out of the desert like a miracle on horseback.